welcome, and thank you for checking in at the Inner Game of Change podcast, where I focus on exploring the multi-layers of managing organizational change. My name is Ali Juma, and you're listening to the Inner Game of Change podcast. My guest today is Tonille Miller, a global transformation and people experience leader. As an organizational psychologist and a strategist, Tonille has been helping and partnering with leaders to drive the optimal performance of themselves, their people, and organizations. In this episode, Tonille and I chat about the critical and unavoidable strong link between the way we manage change and its impact on the employee experience. I'm grateful to have Tonille chatting with me today. So Tonille, thank you so much for your time and welcome to the Inner Game of Change podcast. I'm grateful for you to join me in my podcast as my guest from the States.
Thanks for having me, Ali. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Today, we're going to talk a lot about the link between how we manage change in the workplace and the employee engagement. Great topic and very interesting and far-reaching. Hopefully, we can share a few ideas around it in a very short time. But before then, it will be great if you can introduce yourself to my listeners. Tonille?
Of course. So, hi, everybody. I'm glad to be here. I've spent probably over 15 years at this point as a consultant in all the large consulting firms, as well as an organizational psychologist, and then also what I would consider an organizational strategist, if you will. And what I do for the most part is really partnering and advising leaders, partnering with them and advising them on how to really, drive the optimal performance of themselves, their people, and their organizations. And so most recently, I founded my own consulting firm called EXT, standing for Experience and Transformation. So I'm excited to be part of this discussion.
Fantastic. So we are going to talk about the experience, employee experience, actually, in particular. Really good to have you here. Let's just crack on with it. The way we manage change has got a strong link to the employee engagement. Comment, Tonille?
Agree 1,000%. I'll give us a couple of data points to start out with on this one. So first of all, I think we all pretty much know that very few organizations do change well. And I think we see around 70% of projects and initiatives in organizations fail, right? So the majority of organizations are leaving a ton of money, time, and energy from their people on the table in this regard. And one of the main reasons for this high failure rate is because those people who are managing the change, they rarely focus on the actual experience of the people going through it. They're typically thinking about, okay, what is the IT roadmap? What is it going to cost? What is the timeline? They rarely actually really get empathic and get in the shoes of every single person, not just all of our people as a whole, but every single persona and group, and getting in their shoes and understanding like how that change impacts them, what it's going to feel like to them, how it's going to make them feel, that sort of thing. And so I really feel I've come to the point now after doing this for such a long time that how you lead change will make or break the likelihood of it. And so why do we do change anyways, right? It's typically to realize some sort of ROI or business case, benefits, that sort of thing. And I think McKinsey had a study recently that found that projects that have great change leadership on them, change management, that type of thing, that do it the right way, they're 6 times more likely to be successful and achieve that ROI. So this is actually a really big deal. It's not just touchy-feely, nice to have, soft skills. This is actually very important and very strategic in a way. Well, I was just going to say on that note, I think to wrap this piece up, I think one of the main things with that as well is that there's a lot of different approaches to change, which we'll get into in a minute here, I'm sure. But for the most part, I think one of the other main reasons why change fails is that it's a lot of old school approaches that people take to change. And when I say old school, I mean they're doing change to people, right? Pushing change onto people, not doing it with people and being more co-creative and collaborative. So I'll pause there and just see what your thoughts are on that one.
Yeah, look, I completely agree. I think the frame, you touched on a couple of points. First of all, the frameworks the major ones that are actually in there we've been using, they definitely need to be upgraded. So there's a lot of talk and around this. And I had both ProSci and Kota people in my podcast, and they're doing great work around upgrading their frameworks, because change management, when you deal with people and the people side of change, is far more complicated than a project manager dealing with a project. They've got 3 constraints: their budget, their time, and their scope. We've got so many other things as well. But I do believe that the way we manage the project and with the way we manage the change impacts the employee experience. And that experience is a critical piece of whether I feel I am engaged in my workday or not in the workplace. So it's not just the product, it's how I feel about the product. And so how I feel that the organization, did they communicate with me? Did they support me? Change is disruptive by nature. Have they actually spent the time and paid attention to the resources to actually help me go from A to B, and giving me the time and the space to stuff up if I need to, and I don't feel threatened when I stuff up during the transition. So I know, Tonille, that neuroscience is done. There's a lot of work around neuroscience and tells us a lot about that. Do you have any comment on that?
A lot, actually.
Good.
I'll start out a tiny bit broader, if you don't mind, too, just because there's other pieces. Neuroscience is a key part of this, but there's other things as well. And so when I was mentioning earlier about how there's various strategies or approaches to change, that's what I'm capitalizing on here. And so one of the oldest ones is kind of what we talked about with that compliance base, that command and control, that sort of thing, which was, from back in the day, which totally doesn't work today, as we all know, and it really never worked that well anyways. But, basically what happens with that is it makes adults, right? We're all adults. It makes us feel resentful because they're being treated like little kids. And then at the same time, there's a knock-on effect psychologically called reactance, which is basically says, as humans, one of our key human needs is autonomy. So a feeling we have even a tiny bit of control over our lives. And so when anyone demands as adults that we do something, even something that we already wanted to do or were planning to do, our inner rebel basically emerges. And so this is where we often see people demonstrate disguised ways of resisting change because they're not able to actually, put it out there. So there's that piece, right? Then there's another approach, which is like the behavioral approach, which focuses more on the incentives and disincentives. So we've seen this in organizations, right? Like the carrots and the sticks. And this actually is pretty effective for small changes. Like if we want someone to fill out a survey, you give them a little bonus, you give them a tchotchke, that's easy. But if you want like long-term sustainable behavior change and like engagement in that change and the experience to be great, you have to go further than that. So beyond that, then there's this other thing called the Neo-Behavioural approach, right? And so that operates kind of under the radar a little bit more. So people don't feel like you're doing change to them. And it's things like nudges, choice architecture, designing the environment to kind of produce the behaviors we want to see. And so actually General Mills, it's a company in Minnesota, Minneapolis area that has a great example of this, where just during the pandemic, just recently, they actually, they were noticing burnout in their people. And they basically said, okay, so why don't we, create a program where people can basically opt in, and then to mitigate that burnout, they'll get a couple of additional PTO days, right? Sounds like a nice idea. But they saw that only like 8% of their people opted in for that, which is weird, right? Free time off. Why wouldn't everybody do that? Well, they had to do a little bit more research. And what they realized is that because they didn't offer anyone choice in what they could do to mitigate the burnout, some people, there's all kinds of different reasons, but a lot of people just didn't feel like that was what they wanted, right? So they kind of did the research, they dug in a little more. And what they did then is they created this program called Choice Plus, which basically allowed people to choose as their benefit to mitigate their burnout as the PTO that they had already offered. They also added in, or you could pick a bonus, a certain amount of money, a bonus. And then the other third thing is you could actually have General Mills donate a certain amount of money to your favorite charity. And they found that 85% of people then opted into the program. And when they dug even deeper, the majority of those people chose the PTO. So the company got the same result they actually wanted just by offering choices, right? Yeah. So think about that and how that plays out in certain change projects and organizations in general when you're demanding people come back to the office versus giving them choices to do things. These things are really important, and neuroscience factors in here along with psychology and other things as well. But then there's a couple other approaches, right? So there's the humanistic approach. And if you've ever seen a company that's got like a really great vision, mission, values, that sort of thing, and they not just have a great vision and mission, but like they actually live it, That's kind of that humanistic approach. So with the change project, this really looks like, winning the hearts and minds, giving people something really exciting to rally behind, very inspirational. And this is actually really effective if leaders are walking the talk and role modeling it, as well as like sharing success stories. So that's an approach that can work a little bit when you think about the neuroscience and psychology of people through the course of change. It's so funny though, because even all of these things we just talked about, most of these things can still actually undermine intrinsic motivation to change. And this is some research I've come across recently, where even though the approaches get better and better as we have gone so far, basically in outlining them, they still can mitigate that intrinsic motivation just for various reasons. And so what we found is basically the main key, the way to really drive change successfully, the best approach overall is, again, not doing change to people, not frustrating their psychological needs or intrinsic motivations with external rewards and things like that, but actually doing it with them. And so this is very much employing design principle thinking and co-creating the change with people. So you're bringing people in early on and saying, hey, this is what our vision is for what we're thinking about doing. Tell us why it won't work. Tell us where you see points of friction. Tell us what you think about it. Help us build it, really giving them commitment and agency and ownership of that change. And then they're naturally bought in. They're naturally actually going to champion it for you, and they'll be doing the change because they're doing it with you. So I'm going to pause there, but that's some of the things that I've come across recently when it comes to neuroscience and psychology of change.
And I want to add a couple of things. Well, obviously, what you just mentioned now is that managing change is not a straightforward process. So it's got a lot of variables, a lot of moving parts, and our experiences in the workplace, they're really vulnerable. So I can feel good today about a project, and tomorrow a new project comes along and then it spoils the whole experience. That's why we think, and I think you and I are in agreement here, that the leaders would need to be very interested in the way change is being managed, because it's got a direct link on how people feel in the workplace. That's one component, one critical component of it. You talked about the neuroscience, and I think there are two principles. And first of all, as human beings, we do two things. We try to maximize reward and minimize threat. Mm-hmm. And so when we roll out changes, we need to be cognizant and really aware of those two things. How can I, through my change practice, minimize that threat? And a threat can come in different ways. But also you mentioned the value, for example, of autonomy. David Rock mentions that really extensively in his research, and, the status, the autonomy, the relationships, all of those things, the fairness of the process. We need to really manage all of those things to minimize the threat and maximize the reward. And only when you live in the maximized reward and a level of certainty, then you feel engaged in the business. And that's why you talked about, I think it's got a link to it, when you see organizations got a great purpose and a vision and people living it, that is the environment when change has been managed well, threat is minimized and reward is maximized, because you will never get engaged if you are in a status of threat.
So true. And that really applies to anything, right? So that's for sure for change, right? Because if you're changing, things are uncertain as well. And so if it's not an environment that has psychological safety to where it's okay to quote fail or not do it perfect, not only are you not going to want to make the change because you're worried about failing, but that applies to anything an organization does, innovation, anything, inclusion and belonging, anything. So that's extremely important. Fantastic.
I want to talk about the principle of employee change experience. Who is accountable for it?
It's a great question. And I feel like if you ask anybody, they would say leaders, right? That would be the natural answer. And I agree 100% that leaders need to have a role. It's very specific. They need to lead it. They need to have alignment with it. They need to role model it. They need to sponsor and message it. But I think one of the things that we don't think about often enough is two other groups, which would be managers for sure, because managers are usually the ones really driving it on the ground, right? And kind of really getting grassroots with it. So it's coming from the top, it's coming from the middle. But then, like I said, we need to also be co-creating and bringing, the average person who's going to be impacted, or at least a sample of them, in to build it with us, because then they really get that grassroots movement going from the ground up.
I completely agree. Middle management are the kingmakers. And through the projects that I work on, I always get them together and I say to them, I am a contributor, I'm a facilitator. You need to be interested in what I'm going to do within your team, because everything we do disrupts the equilibrium of your team. And you work very hard to create a cohesive team driven by a purpose. And any change comes in there will actually disrupt a few things in your team. And therefore, you need to be very interested in my change strategy, and you need to have an input into it. Because at the end of the day, it's going to impact how people feel in your team, and therefore that impacts their engagement, their performance, and their productivity.
Yeah, and I love that you hit on that. And I think one of the things you are hitting on, whether you realize it or not, is that means that there's a different business case for leaders than there is for managers, than there is for the average employee, right? When it comes to change. And so that's where a lot of the change work comes in, is that as a change person who's leading or driving change, if you're like on a change team or you're a consultant like I am, a lot of your work is getting in the heads of each of these different groups, right? And understanding like, what is the business case for that leader? It's typically financial. I get it. It's saving the company money. Awesome. But guess what? The average employee does not care about that. The manager probably only cares a little bit about that. So guess what? You can't just say, hey, we're doing this new platform because it's going to save us money, because nobody cares. Yeah. So one of the things you got to do then is get in the shoes of the managers and, like, to your point, and the end users, and find out, what do they care about? Where are their points of friction or loss, potential loss, and where are their benefits? And so that's where a lot of that change impact and stakeholder analysis work comes in, and that type of thing. I actually also take it a step further and do like persona building and journey mapping of the different groups, because then you really get in their heads, and a lot of empathy has to be employed in that.
Absolutely. And one of my guests actually called it, we are living in the project economy, and therefore change is not going to go away. It's going to accelerate. We need to be good at it. And it's a mutual responsibility from the team member to the manager to the leader and the change practitioners, because we are responsible as well for the change experience. What are some of the poorly executed change activities that you've come across that impacts the change experience? I mean, I'm sure you've got a lot, but
so many.
Yeah. But what are the key ones, Tonille?
Yeah, that's a great question. I love that you asked this, because people don't actually ask this piece a lot. I think, first of all, the first strategy we mentioned, the compliance strategy in the beginning, don't do that. Just don't do that to yourself. Don't do that to your people, because it's going to backfire. It's going to be worse than not doing any change strategy. So don't do that one. I think the other piece is I see a lot of leaders who, they know they want the change. They know they need the change. They know they need their people to change, but they're not willing to actually do the hard work. And so that's one thing I've learned in general in life, whether you're an individual trying to make a personal life change or you're a company trying to make a change. It's the same dynamic in the sense of, you want the benefits, you're all excited on that, but you're not actually willing to do that hard work. You're not willing to get up at 5 a.m. and go to the gym every morning. You're not willing to actually be vulnerable and spend extra time coaching your people, and you're not willing to do that. So I think that's some of the stuff, whether it's change or just in general employee experience, pain points in that regard. And then again, like not co-creating with people is a really big miss. I still see it over and over and over, where we just do it to people and expect them to comply.
Yeah, and everybody wants to eat meat, but nobody's willing to hunt. Is that what it is?
Right. You got it.
Yes. Look, we are coming close to the end of the podcast. I'm thoroughly enjoying this conversation, Tonille. You're an experienced, consultant and practitioner. What's your key advice to the change practice community?
Great question. There's so many amazing people doing great work in this space, but I would say, one of the main things I do see as a miss sometimes with change practitioners, and this is something I also see in some HR departments, is they don't operate as strategically as you would want them to, right? Mm-hmm. So what I mean by that is when I go in, and I would learn this at PwC, I learned this very, very well there, is you want to be extremely strategic with this, right? So it's not just another change project or another HR strategy. It is, let's get really clear on what the business is trying to accomplish, all the strategic goals, that sort of thing. And you walk backwards from that. And that's very much how you align the change. You align it with that strategy. You align it with the organization's culture. So you need to get understanding of what that is. If you're a consultant, make sure you do that legwork ahead of time to really understand that. So it's positioned as a very strategic initiative. It's very much embedded in the fabric of their organization. The other piece I see a lot of is people think that once we launch the change, we're done. No, we're not done. That is where change begins. And so make sure you have a sustainability plan, which I would argue it should be almost as robust as the pre-launch plan, right? So you're continuing on with collecting feedback and sending out communications and holding people accountable and making updates and iterating real time based on that feedback and points of friction and pain points that you're hearing from people. So those are probably two of the bigger ones.
Fantastic. And I completely agree. The change. So we've got a wonderful, you probably know him, Dr. Fuda, who said, change is not the goal is the goal, which means what we do is serving a higher purpose. Yeah. So the go live is not the change. The change is actually that, the benefit that you're going to get out of behavior, sustainability, cost, whatever you're going to have to get. And therefore you're going to have to be patient enough to wait and then actually gauge that experience and learn from it so you can, take the learnings to the next one. And you also mentioned the first point that you mentioned around the employee experience.
The strategy, yeah. Making sure you're embedding it within the strategy and the culture of the organization.
So spot on. Yeah. Everything. These are strategy, and the change is actually a contributor to that strategy and what the strategy is trying to achieve. So unless you understand it, and how you're going to understand it by reading, by listening to the leaders, but actually seeing as well things happening. So all of those things are actually your data points to building your change strategy. And the last thing that I want to mention is that, unfortunately, we are driven sometimes, and I used to be one of those a few years ago, or maybe 7-8 years ago. I used to be obsessed with activities. Now I am obsessed by the purpose of the activities. Yeah.
And the results of the activities too. Because being busy doesn't do anything. You want to do the right things, right?
Yeah. So I moved away from, as you called it, from compliance to commitment. So the compliance, moved away. It's important, but it's not the most important. It's the commitment and the purpose behind the change. So really wonderful. We touched on a few great things. Hope I can get you back at some stage and we talk more about this topic. The employee experience is really, and the employee engagement is the critical piece that all leaders, they are the holy grail for all leaders. And therefore, what we're trying to highlight is that the way we manage the change can adversely or positively impact that experience. So pay attention to it. And when I come with a plan, please interrogate me as a leader of why you think, Ali, why you think this strategy is going to help me achieve what I want to achieve and not any different strategy. So I need to be able to articulate why I chose this particular strategy. And the principle of employee engagement is that we will only be engaged when our threat level is very minimum and our reward level is very maximum. And the way we manage the change is actually a contributor to those two. We can heighten the threat, or we can bring it down. It depends on how we manage the change.
Spot on.
Grateful for your time. How would people reach you, Tonille?
Well, I'm on LinkedIn, and then I've also got a website. It's experienceandtransformation.com, all one word. You can find me there.
Fantastic. And we're going to put all the information about you in the podcast. Tonille from New York, it's been a pleasure having you in my podcast, and I look forward to having many more catch-ups in the future. Until then, stay well and stay safe.
Thanks, Ali.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. I hope you enjoyed listening to this episode. To know more about my guests and this podcast, check the innergameofchange.com.au website and remember to subscribe. I can't wait to share with you my next episode. Until then, stay well and stay safe.